Well, again, thank you all for attending today. And I'm going to talk about a subject that I addressed earlier in the year. But when I give these talks on Monday, the hardest part of these things usually is coming up with a subject. And so what I do is I tend to introspect and find things that are going through my mind, impressions perhaps outside of, that stimulate some ideas, perhaps a question that somebody asked me, and I have to think about it, and I'd like to share that. And also sometimes when I'm meditating, and things that I encounter in my own meditation that I'm striving to do, or insight that I have. And I thought, I think I want to talk about that because it's important to me. And by extension, I think it also is important to all of us, because I'm one devotee amongst the billions of us here on this earth. And I'd like to share this subject, which is breathlessness and is deathlessness. And as I've gone on my journey on this spiritual path, I've vacillated between two different approaches to the spiritual path. And I think perhaps this is universal. On the one hand, there's the technical side of the yogi. If I do these techniques as I've been taught by Master, as I've been taught by Swami Jaya, and I focus on the technique and try to do the techniques as best as I can. The second element of this is the element of the heart and the element of divine grace. And these two intersect in this topic of breathlessness is deathlessness. Now we think of it because right at the beginning of it, we would think, well, breathlessness, and I have always been attracted to the subject because it's something technical in the sense that if I do my technique right, I can begin to go into that state of breathlessness, and I can approach the spiritual path in a technical way, which I find quite fascinating. And it's a more of immediate feedback, because we can see our breath becoming slower and slower and slower. And as the breath becomes slower and slower, you can also begin to notice inwardly your own inner state of calmness of the mind, focus of concentration, stillness of the body. All of these things come into play, and it's a very immediate feedback in that way. And so I have a sense of enjoyment there. But on the other hand, just approaching any yogic technique, and let's use this as one example, for Kriya even. When we had a Kriya initiation, by the way, here in Pune yesterday, and we also had a Kriya review. And so I began thinking about this, and I wanted to make the point to the Kriya bonds that technique is what we can do. Technique is what we do, but it's not going to get us to what we want in and of itself of I am doing this technique better and better. But technique has its value in the sense that it aligns us with the flow of grace. It opens the door to allow grace to come in and help us take that final step over whatever it is that's separating us from our divine quest, God coming into our life. So we have to have this element both of practicing the techniques that have been given to us. And that's the beauty of this age that we find ourselves in. We are in Dwapara Yuga, and this is an age of energy, outwardly expanding. Energy is expanded and is become in Dwapara Yuga. It's much more, we're conscious of it. But at the same time, we are evolving energetically inside as well, an awareness of those inner energies that are within us. And so we're propelled, you might say, just by the age that we're living in. If we're attuned with it, we find that ourselves propelled inwardly to seek those, to discover and awaken energies within us. And of course, Kriya is the perfect example of that. And that's why Lahiri Mahasaya came at this time to introduce these techniques of Kriya into this. But our masters always also in the background They also emphasize this quality here, which I want to just touch on today, this goal that we need to keep in mind and keep it forefront when we're meditating. Now, devotion, of course, potentially devotion can carry us to the highest realm, but we have to do our part too. Devotion is whatever we do, we have to do it with devotion. But devotion alone, although it has the potential to take us to our ultimate goal by that, it summons, you could say, that element of grace. The fact that if we can align ourselves through technique, and is why the masters brought this technique in this age, we make that connection much more easy. It's what we can do. And even if we do it imperfectly, by practicing technique properly and doing our techniques as the best of our ability, it's our 25% of the formula, 25% individual effort, 25% grace of Guru on our behalf, and 50% grace of God. So this element is essential on the spiritual path, and this has been presented to us by our gurus, that if we want to reach the highest levels on an outward way of this physical body that we're inhabiting, we need to be able to attain that state of breathlessness. It's because in the popular mind, a person takes up meditation, and meditation now is becoming more popular. Mindfulness, meditation, other techniques, and it's all to the good that such things are happening. But in the popular mind, I think meditation is seen as a means of centering ourselves, becoming more calm, more focused so we can do our job better, we can be relaxed, and it makes us more mindful. And so that's all very good. There's no argument with that. But I wish that there was an understanding in this world amongst people who popularize meditation that it's much more than that. There's something much more as an intention of why we meditate, and than just merely being more successful in our material pursuits. Meditation is meant to help us transcend the ego. And this is what this world is about, and the spiritual path is about, to transcend ego, to free ourselves from this body, and to free ourselves from the breath. Now, in a worldly context, is to say the words, well, let us go breathless, people would look with wide eyes at you, because that's ridiculous. I mean, go breathless, and it seems very marginal to most. It is marginal to most people's understanding, but that really is what we're trying to do. If you think about it like that, but you could say, but even in the Bible, what we want to do is emulate Saint Paul, who said, "Verily, verily, I die daily." In a sense, that's what we want to do. We want to die in the sense that when we die, take the final exit, of course, the breath leaves us. But we want to be able to consciously attain that state, which is what Master said, St. Paul was referring to that. So meditation is, yes, relax the body, calm the mind, focus us, but the real purpose of meditation on the deeper level is self-realization. And that will come to the general understanding of the population of the whole in time, but it's not now, but it will come. And also accompanying that, the achievement of that self-realization, certain necessities are needed. And I'd like to begin here by quoting something that was written by Paramhansa Yogananda. And he says here, I'm reading, "Without properly regulating the breath and solving the mystery, its mystery, by doing away with it, one cannot reach high self-realization. If you can do without breath, you can control bodily life, prolong it, and rise beyond it, to soul while living. To do without breath is not to force or suppress it in the lungs. To watch the breath is the preliminary step in controlling it, because then the consciousness of man separates itself from the involuntary bodily function of breathing and gradually realize itself as distinct from it. Breath is the cord that binds the soul to the body. Man lives in and requires the atmosphere of air, just as a fish needs water. When he learns to rise above breath, man ascends into the celestial realms of the angels. Now, what we're saying here, he's saying we need, because all of us here, I'm assuming, are seeking that highest state of self-realization. For us to be able to attain our goal, it's important for us to keep in mind what's entailed in that quest to rise above the breath at will, and to keep that in mind when we practice our techniques. And this is what Paramhansa Yogananda demonstrated in his life, and he spoke from that level. And there are many spiritual teachers in the world today, many of them in high regard, many of them have large followings of people and all the trappings of a spiritual teacher. And I'm sure they're fine men and women, but rare is the one who is of the same stature of somebody like Paramhansa Yogananda, who could exit the body at will. And very few of those teachers in the modern world have this ability to stop the breath and transcend. And until they do, they're bound in this body and tied to the body, which is the definition of ego. We're still living in the ego consciousness of duality. Now, the ego could be purified to a high degree, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong there, but they're not speaking from the highest plane unless they can attain or demonstrate that ability. And again, Master writes, the rishis, however, have pointed out that the acid test of a master is a man's or woman's ability to enter at will the breathless state and to maintain the unbroken samadhi of nirvikalpa. Only in these achievements can a human being prove that he has mastered Maya, or the dualistic cosmic delusion. He alone can say from the depths of realization, Ekam Sat, only one exists. And as I say, Master spoke from that level. And there's I thought, an interesting story that illustrated that from Master's life and how he would just, he could demonstrate that. Now, and this goes back to the time when he was in America in 1927. And he was traveling across the United States and giving lectures, and he stopped in the city of Minneapolis, which is in the center of the United States, up toward the Canadian border, up in that area. And he was there for 3 or 4 months. He actually stopped there for quite a long time. And while he was there, he did a whole series of beginning, intermediate, and advanced classes. And in his class, he started to give these classes, and one gentleman was in the class and came to introduce himself to Master, and they chatted. And this man was interested in, and Master could see that he had a sincere interest. And so Master said he'd like to come after asking him about what he did for a living and where he worked. And the man said he worked at a certain office building there in Minneapolis. And Master said, "Oh, I'd like to come and visit you at your office someday." And so the man said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And he invited him to his office. So the day that Master was to arrive, there was another gentleman there who was, the man who asked Master to the office was an executive there, a high executive of that company, probably the managing director. But there was another fellow who worked for the company there too, who had similar spiritual ideals as the manager. And so when Master was coming, this other fellow was there with him. And so Master came, and he came into the building, and in the outer offices, it created a big stir because here that, Master had a very impressive appearance and, aura about him. And so there was quite a stir. And then the manager invited Master into his inner office. There were and the other fellow that was the employee was there too. And they began to talk to Master about this. And this fellow was interested. He said, is it possible to understand life after death? Is it possible to understand the higher realms beyond the body? And that's these sort of mystical topics. And is one able to go beyond the body? And he had heard about astral traveling and things like that. And Master says, "Oh yes, you're not bound to this body." And the man asked him, he says, "Really? I mean, how? Tell me more." And it says, Master said, "Would you like me to demonstrate?" And the man was surprised at that. And he said, "Absolutely. Now, would you? How would you do that?" And I says, "Oh, okay, I'll show you." So in this office, there was a nice sofa there, a divan or a couch, and it was a very, one there. And so Master says, "May I use your couch and divan here?" And he says, "Oh, yes, yes." And so Master laid on the sofa, and he made himself comfortable. And he says, "Now, watch." And the man then describes what happened. He says, slowly, Master, he began to breathe slower and slower and slower until finally it didn't seem that he was breathing at all. And he was completely relaxed. Well, that was not what startled him, but he said, what happened? And he says, then the pallor of Master's skin began to go pale. And Master had nice dark skin, but he says it went pale. And he said you could see or visualize the life force going out of him. And he said pretty soon he became a corpse. And if you've ever seen a corpse, a person that's passed on, that look, you can see nothing's there, they're gone. And it just has that, there's no doubt at sometimes. So this is what Master just turned into a corpse. And the man became, he became very worried, and he told his assistant, "Get by that door and don't let anybody in the room." He was afraid somebody's going to come into the room, and he was thinking that, oh my God, he's died. And he's gone. And he began panic stricken. And I took a little excerpt from his story, which he wrote. And the man says, "I have never undergone such much more tension in my life than I had for several minutes, while I felt that there was a corpse on my hands. I was very much in earnest about my supplications for him to return. It was and so he was in a panic because he thought, oh my God, somebody's going to walk in and it's going to be a terrible situation here." And so he began calling Master's name and getting, "Come back, come back." And so he says, it was some moments before the color began to creep back into his face. But by that time, I was so thoroughly panic stricken that I continued my calling until he finally opened his eyes and he sat up. He said that it was not difficult to do when once one had the power. He talked so matter-of-factly about the whole matter that I could not help but give credence to his statements. I had seen. In other words, for himself, he had seen. And Master had that ability. He could just dispel the breath, and basically when that happens, of course, is when you go beyond breath, the breath stops, and the way to stop the breath is you calm the heart and you stop the heart. And of course, Master many times demonstrated in his life his ability to control his heartbeat and actually to stop the heart. Because when the heart stops pumping, there's no need for the breath anymore. The breath merely is bringing in oxygen and getting rid of carbon, which the breath then distributes around through the body. So if there's no breathing and if there's no heart, there's no need for the breath either. And so Master demonstrated this in his life. And it's the cutting, as I said, to be able to get to that state of control of the body is what cuts the cord between the body and the soul. The body, then you could say that one is free. The soul nature of one is free from that body and can withdraw from it into the astral realm. And this is what all of us as we're meditating, as we're practicing yoga, if we're Kriya yogis, this is the direction to keep in mind as we're trying, and because it's essential to be able to go to that state. And why? It's because at that point, we gain the ability to transcend ego. And it's the ego that keeps us in this egotistical identification with the body that keeps us in this world of duality, to this world of suffering. As Krishna said to Arjuna, "Oh, Arjuna, get away from this world of suffering, ocean of suffering." And this is what we're trying to do, to be able to transcend that. Now, obviously, to do that, there's many things that have to accompany that. We have to be prepared for that. But yet, we can also, because Master gave us the techniques and he told his students, practice this to get to the point, practice until you can go breathless. And then we begin to open up the door, because that's not the end of the journey by any means. There's still a long way to go after that. But at that point, you could say we gain that ability then to really begin to make spiritual progress. And he said, this is available to everybody. We can do this. Now, the implication there is that we, by our own strength of will, can do that. But as I've studied these teachings and gone more into my own devotional approach to life and to yoga, I've come to see that there are two things necessary: our effort, but also the attunement with divine grace, and specifically Guru's grace. Can we create that state within ourselves without that grace? And personally, I don't think so. We have to, because we cannot lift ourselves out of ego consciousness without some agency from outside of ourselves. And that's what the Guru offers us. We offer that we need to have a higher realm with which we must attune to be able to make that final transition. So these two things come into play: our individual effort, but that effort is to align ourselves with the flow of divine grace. And this is how we must approach our Kriya practice. But even before that, because Master was teaching, like he was teaching this man I spoke of, and many others, he said through the practice of Hong Sa, this can be attained. Kriya, of course, helps. But he was saying through the diligent practice of Hong Sa, this opportunity is there for all of us. But I think he might have also said, if you practice as I instruct you. Now, there's a lot implied in that cautionary phrase. Now, there's another story, the shorter story, that Master had that ability within himself, but he, as a guru, he could transmit that to others. And there's the story of Mr. Vickerman I believe it was in the 1920s also. Mr. Vickerman met Master, and Mr. Vickerman had actually heard about breathlessness and in his study of yoga, but he had tried on his own, and he could not achieve that. And he was obviously a very intent person. And he kept going to various spiritual teachers to try to find out, can somebody teach me this? How do I go breathless? He came to an understanding that it was something necessary, and the breath is an impediment It's not the goal to go breathless, I mean, the final goal, but it's on the way to that. It's an impediment for us to be able to make serious progress beyond that. And he knew that and came to understand that, but he couldn't find anybody that would help him. And so I believe it was in the city of Philadelphia, which is on the East Coast, pretty much, of America. Master was there giving a lecture, and he was walking down the street and he saw a poster of Paramhansa Yogananda, one of those early posters that we have copies of, announcing a lecture that night. And so he saw it, but he said no. He had been to so many spiritual teachers who could not give him the means by which he could attain what he was looking for. So he said, no, I'm not going to do it. But he did not go to the lecture, but he decided to wait until the lecture was over. And he did. And he met Yogananda. And it's said that Mr. Vikraman was a very blunt person. Swami Kriyananda had met him and knew him. And he said he had a very blunt personality. And as it turned out, by the way, Mr. Vikraman was supposedly had been a son of Paramhansa Yogananda in a previous incarnation. And so maybe that had some karmic element to this meeting. But in any case, Mr. Vikraman saw Yogananda after the lecture, and he went up to him and he introduced himself, and the master asked, can I help you? And master says, yes, can you teach me how to go breathless? And, just right off the bat, he just said that. And master says, yes, I think so, I can. And so he invited Mr. Vikraman to come with me. And then they went probably to Yogananda's room, rooms where he was staying. And basically, when they got into a private situation, what he did is he just tapped him on the chest. And Mr. Vikraman, he said, I entered his room and he touched me on the chest. And all at once, my breath stopped. I entered the breathless state of superconsciousness. And he went into a superconscious ecstasy just off that touch. Now, and then he went on to say, since then, and he wouldn't follow anybody before that, but since then, I have been his devoted follower. And of course, wouldn't any of us, that experience happened to him on their very first meeting, similar in a sense to Dr. Lewis, who met him. But but it goes to show that both he and that other fellow, that manager, they were not particularly religious before that. They were truth seekers, though, both of them. Both of them wanted to know what is the nature of this world. And wouldn't call them devotional in the outward sense, but they were devotional in the sense that they were devoted to seeking something high in life. And I think it's good to keep that in mind, that to have that desire, that quest always in mind. And so Master, his mission given to him by his gurus was to bring these techniques into the world, into the world at large, to allow people who are willing to practice faithfully to achieve this. And he would tell the audience, you can do it. You can do it. If they're willing to practice, of course, you can do this. And the main technique, of course, he brought was Kriya Yoga. But I want to focus here and encourage you with this other technique that he was introducing to everybody at that time, which is Hong Sa. And I think all of you out there watching are practitioners that it's something so simple, but because it's simple, we sometimes take those things that are simple, we take them for granted. But with Hong Sa, we have a tool by which we can, if we practice, we can attain the stilling of the breath, the stilling of the heart, in and of that same very simple method. And again, I read here something Master wrote. He said, so we understand what's going on here when we're practicing Hong Sa. He says, when the heart rests, breath becomes unnecessary. The life energy is then withdrawn from the heart and the sensory nerves, and thus disconnects the telephones of the five senses, which ordinarily keep the ego perpetually disturbed, the waves, constantly in waves, and the attention scattered by the incessant sensory messages from the outside world. If one can learn to control the heartbeat, he can experience the conscious death, leaving and re-entering the body at will. He can die daily like St. Paul, and like many yogis of India who have practiced this Hong Sa exercise and have through it achieved mastery over the action of the heart. Now, we don't often talk about this because it seems to be so otherworldly, stopping the heart. Who's ever heard of anybody stopping the heart, other than a yogi, perhaps? It's not common everyday conversation at all. And it's probably people would think us a little bit crazy to be talking that way in worldly conversation. But that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to at least get that heart rate to stop, to slow down. And there's many things that go into it, because when we practice, and Hong Sa can take us to that direction if we practice with fervor and dedication, but we have to cooperate also with it. The function of the breath, of course, is to help expel carbon from the body. So we have to look at our lives. What are those things that are causing a lot of toxins, which carbon is, in this, at least in this context? What are those things that are causing us to be toxic? It's diet, lack of bodily exercise, all of those things, poor conditioning, things that create disturbance within us. The mental restlessness itself is creating a lot of activity that's necessary. Blood flow is necessary to keep even the brain going in that way. It can't rest. So all of these things we have to cooperate. And if we do, we very naturally begin to enter into that calm state. And Swami used to say, I don't know if he was quoting Master or not, but he used to say, the science of mastering the breath has been, as many others have said, so I guess he was quoting, has been said to be India's greatest contribution to the library of world knowledge. The science of mastering the breath. It's so very essential, and it's breath that ties the soul to the body. And so the whole spiritual path, which by definition, soul tied to the body is ego consciousness. And so to be able to do this, and so I think what I would like to suggest is that each of us, we've come into this path, and one of the first things we've learned is this Hong Sa technique, is to go back to it and give it some focus. Master, we often say, so would practice this when he was a youth for multiple hours a day. And he went into very deep states just with that. And I found in my own personal practice of this, I come back to Hong Sa periodically. You could say I go along and I kind of marginalize it a little bit. I always practice it, but I don't give it the hours that perhaps I should, until I plateau. And I get to a point of a little bit, I don't feel I'm advancing in my practices. I'm on a plateau or something's stagnant or stale. And there's usually two elements that go to cause that with me, which you might say, or there's maybe many elements, but there's two elements that I turn to get myself out of that. And one, I go back to the basics of what I learned when I first came on the path, what Master taught, practice Hong Sa, and do it with concentration and diligence, and do it deeply and for a long time as well. And just practice that and watch the breath become still. Now we have to cooperate with it by the body being relaxed and, proper diet and all of that. And then the second thing is do it with devotion. And I remember this story of Master touching that devotee, Mr. Vikraman, on the chest and going into an ecstasy. So in a sense, I do Hong Sa in the and appeal to Master to free me, Master, take away this breath. Offer this breath up to the Guru. Take it away, Master. And putting these two together, the devotional side and the mechanical side, I think are the elements of what the aspiring yogi needs to include. Now, we can use other means. I mean, your technique, you could practice Kriya, and maybe that's even better for some people, or some other practice. There's many that we have, and also the devotional side. But I find going back to this such a simple technique, calming the breath, making the body still until the breath begins to stop. And you notice what I do even is when I put this sort of focus on it, is I watch my breath. How many times am I breathing? 5, 6, 10 times a minute, whatever it might be. And I watch it go, and you get it down to a very slow rate. And I had, even a clock with the second hand going around. And I notice for myself, and probably everybody's a little bit individualistic on this, I know if I come to the point of breathing less than 2 breaths a minute, I notice a sense of consciousness change within me. I begin to interiorize the mind, and I begin to become still within. Try it and see what number works for you. Maybe it's interesting though, with 2 breaths a minute, because if we do our kriyas very still, with concentration, good breath capacity, concentration, focus with breath, oftentimes 2 kriyas per minute is a good pace for a nice, slow, steady pace. So interesting. So obviously the ability to breathe to only 2 times a minute is right there, because if we're practicing Kriya deeply, we're doing something very similar. So I find that's my experience. Now, what is your experience? Why don't you practice it and see, especially in those times when you find that you're stuck. Yeah, that's what I meant when I said plateaued. Sometimes we just get stuck, and we need to somehow, like a car or a truck stuck in the mud. You go forward and you roll back. You go forward and you roll back. And at each time, you're just putting a little bit till finally you break free. And you can proceed on the spiritual path. Through slowing the breath down, the blood becomes purified, oxygenated, less carbon, decarbonized, maybe we should say it that way, until finally the breath becomes slow and in time. Now, I notice the heart doesn't always slow down right away, but if you accompany it with living and do this over a period of time, you'll find that the heart begins to slow down too. And this is one of the secrets of being able to, you might say, extend our life, our yearly capacity. Obviously, there's many things involved in that. It's very complicated, but it's helpful. Some people say that the day we're born, we're given so many breaths, and if you use them up fast, well, death comes more quickly. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know that those species of animals that are slow breathing, and I think Sri Yukteswar used to make this point, they tend to be a little bit more long-lived. And I think it's an indication of people who are in a good, healthy state and that are calm, that are centered, the breath becomes calm. So why don't you try this? I'm sharing this with you because it's been something that's been inspirational for me lately, and I felt this need to dive deep into the meditation. Go deep. You can practice this. Practice, and I give you this challenge, which I've challenged myself with. Can you practice Hong Sa for an hour? I think all of us can practice for 15 minutes. We've probably done that many times. Maybe you extend it to 30 minutes. Try that. And if that's a stretch for you, use that as your goal. I'm going to practice Kriya Yoga. I'm not Kriya Yoga. I'm going to practice Hong Sa 30 minutes. Now, the other thing is practice Hong Sa in the spine. This is also, that's the baby Kriya. And you'll find that is helpful too. That's very helpful in that. You can go review your lessons on that, review the technique of that, and following the breath, watching it rise up and down as if it's going up and down the spine. And you'll find that that in itself magnetizes the spine and it begins to withdraw the life force away from the senses. Try it. See if you can do it a half an hour and then extend it to go a full hour. So take up the challenge, perhaps, if you feel inclined to. And if you do, I wish you all the very best to be able to be successful in this. And look to see if it makes a difference for you in your daily life and into your daily sadhana. If you're stuck, like sometimes I get, this is one way to get out of it, but do it also. And I'll leave this as the closing words. Do it not just as technique, but do it as a devotional offering. Do it with devotion. Ask the Master, bless me, Master, take away this ego, take away this breath. Let me offer myself 100% to you and see if it doesn't change your consciousness. Joy to all of you.